Have you ever seen a moment so powerful, so unexpected, that it made you question everything you thought you knew about life, money, and power? Imagine this. In the heart of New York City, inside a grand ballroom filled with laughter, music, and glittering chandeliers, a man who seemed untouchable suddenly fell to the floor. His name was Richard Miller, a millionaire whose influence stretched across the country, a man known for his arrogance, his fortune, and his belief that money could buy him control over every situation. But on that night, surrounded by his peers and the flashing lights of wealth, Richard collapsed in pain, and for the first time in his life, money could not save him. Panic rippled through the room. Guests rushed to their feet, whispers turning into frantic shouts. Paramedics arrived in minutes, but even with all the advanced technology at their disposal, their faces carried the same grim expression. The verdict was whispered behind gloved hands. There's nothing more we can do. Can you imagine hearing that? That all the power, the influence, the fortune in the world meant nothing in that single fragile moment? Have you ever been through something where everything you thought you controlled slipped right out of your hands? Stay with me, because what happened next is something no doctor, no scientist, no journalist could fully explain. While the professionals gave up hope, another figure appeared at the edge of the chaos. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't part of the wealthy elite seated at those velvet-covered tables. She was just a child. An 8-year-old girl named Emily Johnson, standing beside her mother, who worked that night as one of the servers. A girl from a modest neighborhood, dressed simply, eyes wide as she watched the commotion unfold. Nobody noticed her at first. Nobody expected that someone so small, so ordinary, could carry within her something extraordinary. And yet, as the crowd pulled back, as the fear of death hung heavy in the air, Emily did something unthinkable. She walked forward, step by step, past the towering men in tuxedos and women clutching their pearls. She moved closer to the fallen millionaire. You might be wondering, why would a child do that? What gave her the courage? What you're about to discover now may surprise you. Emily knelt beside Richard, whose face was pale and lifeless, and placed her tiny hand on his. Just a simple gesture. No machines, no medicine, no power plays, only a touch. But that touch was something that went beyond logic, beyond science, beyond anything the wealthy guests or even the doctors could comprehend. In that moment, Richard's chest rose. His breathing steadied. A faint color returned to his cheeks. The crowd gasped. Was it luck, a coincidence, or something else entirely? You see, this story isn't just about a man with millions of dollars or a little girl with nothing but innocence. It's about the collision of two worlds, arrogance and humility, wealth and simplicity, despair and hope. It's about how sometimes, when the strongest collapse, the weakest rise with a strength no one expects. Have you ever witnessed a moment where the most unlikely person changed everything? Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind what happened that night goes far deeper than what the newspapers reported. Doctors would later argue. Reporters would write their headlines. But for Richard Miller, the millionaire who thought he could control life itself, the miracle that saved him was not found in any hospital, nor in the fortune he had built. It came from a child's hands. And this is where our journey begins. Because what followed after that night would not only transform Richard's life, but also leave everyone who witnessed it questioning what true power really is. Maybe you've felt something stirring inside you as you listen to this story, the weight of that ballroom moment, the image of a powerful man brought to his knees, and a child's simple touch changing everything. If this already resonates with you in some way, I'd love for you to share it. Leave a comment below, not just as words on a screen, but as part of a conversation we're building together here. Tell me what this story makes you think of. Maybe a time when you saw strength appear in the most unlikely place, or when someone's kindness gave you hope. Your words might be the very thing another person reading the comments needs to hear today. And if you feel this message has a meaning worth spreading, A simple click on the like button goes further than you might imagine. It tells the platform that stories like this matter, that people are still hungry for reminders of humanity, humility, and unexpected miracles. Every like helps this channel reach someone who may need a little light in their darkest moment. More than that, if you're new here and you want to keep walking with me through stories that challenge, heal, and inspire, I invite you to subscribe. By doing so, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community of people who believe in the power of storytelling to bring us closer, to spark reflection, and to remind us of what truly matters. So if this touched your heart in any way, take a moment to comment, like, and subscribe. It may feel small, but it means the world for the continuity of this space. Together, we can make sure stories like Richard and Emily's keep finding the people who need them most. Now let's return to that night in New York, because what happened after Richard opened his eyes would change not only his life, but the way he saw every single person around him. Richard Miller's world was built on skyscrapers of glass and steel, towers that mirrored his ambition and his certainty that he was untouchable. He was the kind of man whose very presence commanded silence in a boardroom, whose name carried weight on Wall Street, and whose signature could make or break entire companies. His empire stretched from New York to Los Angeles, with properties, investments, and ventures that seemed endless. He moved through life with the polished confidence of someone who had always won, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. Inside his Manhattan office, overlooking the city from the 50th floor, the signs of power were everywhere. Italian leather chairs, polished marble floors, an art collection chosen not for passion, but for price tags. Even the books on his shelves weren't read, but selected by interior. Designers to reflect an image of authority and intellect. Richard wore custom-tailored suits, each one costing more than the monthly rent of the people who served him coffee in the morning. To him, wealth was not just a measure of success, it was proof that he was smarter, faster, stronger than anyone else. Yet behind that carefully curated image, there was something else, an emptiness that no one dared to speak about. Money had given him everything, except the one thing it could never buy: warmth. His relationships were transactional, his friendships conditional, his heart shielded, and he believed that was how it should be. In his mind, emotions were weaknesses, compassion was a distraction, and love was nothing more than a negotiation with different terms. "People don't care about who you are," he once told his personal assistant, a young man named David, who often struggled to keep up with Richard's impossible demands. "They care about what you can give them. And I can give more than anyone else. That's why I win. That's why I'll always win." David had nodded, but deep down he wondered if his boss really believed his own words, or if he repeated them like armor, covering something he didn't want anyone to see. Richard's days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, contracts, and flights. He thrived on the rhythm of deals and negotiations, a symphony of power where he was always the conductor. The way he spoke left no room for doubt. The way he moved left no space for hesitation. To outsiders, he looked like a man who had mastered the game of life. But to those closer, there was something chilling about him, a sense that he measured every human interaction in terms of profit and loss. He didn't attend charity galas because he cared about the causes. They were opportunities to be photographed shaking hands, opportunities to remind people that Richard Miller was not just wealthy, he was visible. Even when he donated, it was strategic, carefully calculated for tax benefits and public image. "Generosity," he once remarked during a business dinner, "isn't about kindness. It's an investment with better returns than people realize." It wasn't always this way. Richard hadn't been born into luxury. He had clawed his way up from a modest childhood in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a school secretary. He had watched his parents argue late into the night about bills, watched his father's pride shrink under the weight of debt, watched his mother save pennies in a jar, hoping they would be enough for groceries. That environment lit a fire in him. As a teenager, he promised himself he would never feel powerless again. He would never allow himself to be small, ordinary, or forgotten. And so he worked relentlessly. Scholarships, internships, long nights of study and strategy. He was brilliant, and he was ruthless. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he had already built a company that would make him millions. By 50, he had multiplied that. Fortune several times over. But with every success, with every deal closed, he built walls around himself, walls that no one could climb, not even those who tried to love him. Those who did get close often left disillusioned. His ex-wife Linda once said during their divorce proceedings, "Richard doesn't see people, he sees assets and liabilities." His only son Michael had grown distant, tired of being managed like a project rather than loved like a child. Richard dismissed their complaints with the same cold logic he used in business. If they can't keep up, it's not my problem. And yet, despite his certainty, there were cracks in the facade. In quiet moments, rare as they were, he sometimes stared at the city from his office window and wondered if winning had cost him more than he realized. He silenced those thoughts quickly, convincing himself that regret was for the weak. But fate has a way of challenging even the strongest illusions. For Richard, the challenge came not in the form of a business rival, not in a financial loss, but in something he never anticipated, his own body betraying him. The very man who believed he controlled every variable, every outcome, suddenly found himself facing a force he couldn't negotiate with. It began as subtle discomfort, a tightness in his chest he brushed off as stress. He ignored the warnings as he always did, because in his world, acknowledging weakness was the same as surrendering power. His doctor had advised him to slow down, to reconsider the late nights, the endless travel, the constant stress. But Richard laughed it off. "I didn't get here by slowing down," he said, "and I'm not about to start now." His mindset was clear. Health could be managed like a portfolio, with the right specialists, the right medicine, the best private hospitals. He truly believed that no matter what went wrong, there would always be a solution he could pay for. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that money has its limits. No checkbook, no investment, no influence could stop what was building inside him. And on that night in New York, as champagne glasses clinked and music echoed through the grand ballroom, those hidden truths came crashing forward. Richard Miller, the man who thought himself invincible, would discover in a single moment that all the power in the world meant nothing when confronted with the fragility of life. And that was only the beginning of his transformation, a journey that would lead him from arrogance to humility, from despair to a revelation that not even he could have foreseen. Because just as his body gave way, just as his world seemed to collapse, someone unexpected was about to step forward, someone whose presence would impact him more deeply than all the fortunes he had ever made. The gala was meant to be one of Richard Miller's crowning moments. It was the annual charity banquet hosted at the Metropolitan Grand Hotel in New York, a place where marble staircases gleamed under golden chandeliers and where the city's elite came, dressed in gowns and tuxedos that whispered of wealth and status. For Richard, it was more than a night of appearances. It was another chance to showcase his influence. Cameras flashed as he entered the ballroom, his perfectly tailored suit catching the light like armor. He shook hands with senators, exchanged words with CEOs, and posed beside celebrities who were more than happy to bask in the shadow of his fortune. To everyone watching, Richard looked untouchable, the very picture of a man who had conquered life itself. But behind the polished smile, his body carried a hidden truth. Weeks of chest pains ignored. Nights of breathlessness dismissed as exhaustion. He had brushed off every warning with the same stubbornness that had built his empire. To Richard, acknowledging weakness was unthinkable. "I don't slow down," he had told a colleague earlier that week. "Slowing down is for people who can afford to lose. I don't lose." He said it with the same sharp certainty he used in the boardroom, but deep inside, there had been a flicker of unease, a flicker he quickly buried beneath bravado. That night, as champagne glasses clinked and music from a live jazz band filled the room, Richard felt the weight of his empire pressing down on him in a way he couldn't quite name. His head swam as he stood to deliver a speech, the kind of address that reminded people why they admired and feared him. He gripped the microphone, his voice booming confidently at first, but then, mid-sentence, the words caught in his throat. His chest tightened, a sharp pain radiating through his arm, his vision blurred. And then it happened. In front of 300 of the city's most powerful figures, Richard Miller collapsed. The room froze. For a moment there was disbelief, as though the fall of such a man was impossible to comprehend. Gasps rose from the crowd, the clatter of silverware echoing against marble floors. Someone screamed. The band stopped playing mid-note. "Call 911!" a voice shouted, breaking the paralysis. Chairs scraped back as people rushed forward, though most kept a cautious distance, unsure what to do. A few guests bent down, trying to rouse him, but Richard's body remained still, his skin pale under the harsh ballroom lights. His lips parted slightly, gasping for air, but the sound was faint, fragile. For the first time in decades, Richard was powerless, and everyone could see it. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. Their uniforms and equipment brought a fleeting sense of order to the chaos, but the tension in the room remained thick. Guests watched with wide eyes as the professionals worked, attaching monitors, delivering oxygen, checking vitals with practiced urgency. The silence was broken only by the beeping of machines and the clipped instructions of the medics. Yet even amid all the technology, the numbers told a grim story. His heart rhythm faltered, his pulse weak. One of the doctors, a middle-aged man with years of experience in emergency care, leaned close to a colleague, his voice barely a whisper, but still audible to those nearby. "There's nothing more we can do." The words rippled through the room like a cold wind, settling over the crowd with finality. People who had admired Richard, envied him, even feared him, now looked on in silence, confronted by the fragility of the man they thought invincible. In those moments, wealth was meaningless. No bank account could bargain with a failing heart. No influence could rewrite biology. And Richard himself, semi-conscious, felt it in a way he never had before. His mind, foggy but aware, grasped at the edges of reality. He wanted to speak, to shout, to order his body to obey him as he had always ordered others. Instead, what came out was a faint whisper, almost a confession. "Not like this." His words were barely audible, but those closest heard them, and for the first time, Richard's voice carried no power, only fear. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some turning away, others staring with morbid curiosity. It was as if the entire illusion of control that had surrounded him had cracked open. He was no longer the untouchable millionaire. He was just another man on the floor, vulnerable, fighting for each breath. For many, it was a revelation, a hidden truth laid bare. Power, when stripped of health, was nothing but a shadow. As medics continued their efforts, whispers moved through the ballroom like fire. Some muttered prayers, others exchanged glances heavy with unspoken thoughts. A senator leaned over to his wife and whispered, "I've never seen him like this." A business rival in the corner allowed himself a fleeting thought of triumph, though guilt followed quickly after. For most, though, the impact was profound. They were watching the collapse of a man who embodied success, and in that collapse was a reminder of their own mortality. Richard's own perception wavered. Between darkness and brief moments of clarity, in those flashes memories surfaced. His father's weary face at the kitchen table, his mother's quiet sacrifices, his son's disappointed eyes when he missed another baseball game. He had spent his life chasing control, building walls of wealth to protect himself from vulnerability. Yet here he was, stripped of everything, reduced to the same fragility he had spent decades running from. "I'm not ready," he murmured once. though it was unclear if he was speaking to the medics, to himself, or to some force beyond the room. His hand twitched slightly, as though trying to grasp something invisible. It was a gesture of desperation, of surrender, a gesture that revealed more about Richard Miller than years of headlines ever had. And then, as the medical team exchanged worried glances, the unthinkable settled in. The man who had built an empire was slipping away, and nothing in the room, no amount of knowledge, no amount of wealth, could stop it. Yet in that fragile, suspended moment, as if the universe had conspired to reveal the hidden balance between arrogance and humility, another presence began to emerge. It wasn't the doctors, with their machines and experience. It wasn't the guests, paralyzed by fear and awe. It was something unexpected, almost invisible at first. A quiet figure watching from the side of the room, unnoticed until now, was about to step forward. And that figure would change everything. In the far corner of the ballroom, while the wealthiest families of New York stood frozen in disbelief, a little girl clutched her mother's hand. Emily Johnson was only 8 years old, her eyes wide as she tried to make sense of the chaos. Her mother, Sarah, worked as part of the serving staff that evening, dressed in a plain black uniform, balancing trays of drinks that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama unfolding in the center of the room. Emily wasn't supposed to be there. The hotel rules were clear. Children weren't allowed in staff areas during an event of such grandeur. But Sarah had no choice. A babysitter had cancelled last minute, and with bills pressing and rent overdue, she couldn't risk losing her shift. So she brought Emily, hoping her daughter could quietly sit in the back and colour while she worked. Yet fate doesn't always follow rules. Emily's small figure stood out against the glittering crowd of gowns and tuxedos, a reminder of another world that rarely brushed shoulders. With this one, she wore a simple hand-me-down dress, a pale blue one with a tiny tear at the hem, her shoes scuffed from running on cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood in Queens. She didn't belong in that ballroom of chandeliers and marble, and yet, in that moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. As the paramedics surrounded Richard Miller, their voices clipped and urgent, Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling with something she didn't fully understand. "He looks so alone." Sarah tried to hush her, pulling Emily closer. "Sweetheart, stay back. It's not for us to step in. They'll take care of it." But Emily's gaze never left Richard. She didn't see him as the towering figure of arrogance he had always projected. She didn't see the millions of dollars, the reputation, or the empire. What she saw was a man who was scared, a man whose eyes pleaded for something that even the most advanced machines couldn't provide. Emily had always been different from other children her age. She was quiet, observant, the kind of girl who noticed when neighbors came home with tired faces, or when her mother pretended her own stomach wasn't empty so Emily could have a full plate of food. She had an instinct for feelings, a way of sensing what lay beneath the surface. At school, she would sit beside the lonely kid at lunch without being asked, offering half of her sandwich as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her teachers often said she carried an old soul, a kind of wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Now, standing in that opulent ballroom, Emily felt a pull she couldn't explain. It was more than curiosity. It was something deeper, almost like a calling. She loosened her grip from her mother's hand and took a hesitant step forward. Sarah's eyes widened in panic. "Emily, no!" she whispered harshly. But the girl didn't stop. Her tiny footsteps echoed on the polished floor, faint but distinct enough to draw a few startled glances from the crowd. The guests, so used to ignoring the presence of staff, now found themselves watching this child crossing the invisible barrier between wealth and service. Some frowned in disapproval, others whispered, wondering why a little girl was there at all. But Emily didn't notice. Her focus was locked on Richard's pale face, the way his hand twitched weakly, as if searching for something to hold on to. She remembered something her grandmother once told her before she passed. A way, When someone is hurting, child, sometimes all they need is to know they're not alone. Sometimes your presence is stronger than any cure. Those words had stuck with Emily, though at 8 years old she could hardly understand their depth. Tonight, however, they returned with clarity. Emily knelt down on the polished marble floor, close enough now to hear the shallow rasp of Richard's breath. The doctors hardly noticed her at first, too consumed with monitors and defibrillators, their voices sharp with urgency. But one nurse glanced down and gasped. "Who's this? Get her back," she began. But Emily had already reached out. Her small hand, trembling yet steady, found Richard's. The room seemed to pause. The tension, the noise, the frantic energy, all of it dimmed as her fingers wrapped gently around his. Richard's eyelids flickered. His lips moved, forming words too soft for most to hear. But Emily leaned close, her voice a whisper filled with conviction. "It's okay, mister. You're not alone. You're gonna be okay." Sarah stood frozen, torn between pulling her daughter away and witnessing something she couldn't quite understand. She expected outrage from the guests, perhaps even scolding from the hotel manager, but instead, the crowd grew eerily quiet. For all their status and wealth, none of them had dared to approach the fallen man. Yet here was a child, untouched by pride or fear, stepping into the center of the storm with nothing but innocence and hope. And Richard, who had spent his life believing that money could solve everything, felt something unfamiliar coursing through him. It wasn't the jolt of medicine, nor the cold efficiency of machines. It was warmth, a fragile, steady warmth, flowing from the hand of a little girl he had never seen before. His eyes opened slightly, searching, finding her face. For the first time in years, his expression softened, not in command, not in calculation, but in surrender. Inside the minds of those watching, a hidden truth began to form. They realized that in a room filled with millions of dollars worth of diamonds, gowns, and investments, the most valuable thing was something far simpler: the courage of a child who chose compassion over fear. It was a revelation, a quiet transformation that no speech, no headline, no contract could have produced. Emily's whisper continued, words that seemed to weave into the fabric of the moment. "Don't give up. You're stronger than this. Just breathe." To her, it was instinct, comforting someone who was scared. To everyone else, it was extraordinary. Even the doctors hesitated, exchanging glances as Richard's breathing steadied, his pulse growing faintly stronger under their monitors. Science would later search for explanations, debating coincidence versus timing, but those who stood in that ballroom knew they had witnessed something beyond numbers and charts. They had seen a different kind of power at work, one that couldn't be measured in wealth or analyzed in medical journals. And as Emily held his hand, the scene transformed. The once cold ballroom, filled with whispers of despair, now carried a different energy, one of awe, one of possibility. It was as if every person present was forced to confront a simple, undeniable truth. Sometimes the smallest hands can carry the greatest strength. The little girl, who should never have been in that room, had become the center of it. And as Richard's eyes fluttered open, the weight of his empire, forgotten for a moment, he saw not the faces of senators or businessmen, but the steady gaze of an 8-year-old child who believed he could still fight. What unfolded next would not only redefine Richard's life, but ripple far beyond that ballroom, setting in motion a journey neither he nor Emily could have imagined. For a breathless moment, after Emily's small hand found Richard's, the ballroom held its breath with her. The hush that fell across the crowd wasn't commanded by wealth or status. It rose from something simpler and older than both. A human pause when the script changes, when an unexpected decision rewrites the scene. People who moments earlier had stepped back now leaned forward without moving, drawn by a turning point they didn't understand. Emily knelt where polished marble met the hem of her pale blue dress, and Richard, who had measured a lifetime by contracts and outcomes, felt a different kind of ledger open inside his chest. He had always trusted numbers. What touched him now was beyond calculation. His mind, foggy and resistant, tried to make sense of it, but the logic that once ruled his mindset couldn't explain the warmth traveling from that small palm into his failing body. He heard the paramedics' clipped instructions as if from underwater, and then, closer than any voice in the room, a whisper, "You're not alone. Just breathe." A nurse started forward and stopped, unsure whether to pull the child away or let her be. The doctor, who had lowered his voice to say there was nothing more to do, glanced down, and for a second his certainty wavered. Machines blinked with numbers that were stubbornly unimpressive, yet the air itself felt different, as if the room's center had shifted from the table of donors and dignitaries to the fragile line between a tiny hand and a man's broken pride. The contrast didn't belong to headlines, rich and poor, power and innocence. It belonged to the hidden truth of being alive in the same room and realizing how thin the walls are between us. Emily's presence made that truth visible. Richard's breath skittered like a wheel on ice. He was dimly aware of his own heartbeat fracturing its rhythm, aware of the strange humility that leaks in when control leaves. He wanted to pull away, not from the child, but from what her touch required him to admit. "I'm fine," he tried to say, an old reflex firing. What emerged was closer to a ragged exhale than a sentence. Inside, his thoughts swung between two anchors, one familiar and failing, the other new and undeserved. The familiar anchor said, "Money fixes this, procure more expertise, force the outcome." The new one said nothing, only steadied him through the quiet of skin-to-skin contact. "Sir," Emily breathed, leaning a little closer, "it's okay to rest for a second. You can start again." Sarah stood a few steps behind, hands clasped, torn between the fear of breaking rules and the fear of breaking faith with what she knew about her daughter. "Emily." "Honey," she whispered, voice shaking, "be careful." "I am," Emily answered without looking up, and the steadiness of those two words made even her mother stop moving. The behind-the-scenes choreography of service, refilling glasses, clearing plates, reheating desserts, fell away as the staff formed the same wide circle as the guests. Within that circle, the drama was intimate, almost domestic, a child holding a hand, a man choosing whether to let himself be held. Richard's eyes opened to a narrow seam of light and the outline of a face he didn't know. He had spent decades training himself to read people in seconds, assessing leverage, detecting weakness, calculating risk. The habit rose automatically and then failed him. There was nothing to read, no bargaining chip to find. There was only presence. "Why are you here?" he managed, a whisper dry as paper. "Because you're scared," Emily answered, as if that were the most ordinary thing to say. "And scared people shouldn't be by themselves." The words carried no pity. They were not charity. They sounded like a decision she made long before his collapse, a way she had chosen to move through the world. Somewhere near the bandstand, a glass cracked under the heel of a guest who didn't notice. The sound traveled like a small, sharp truth. A senator coughed into his fist. A socialite dabbed her mascara carefully, not to smudge it. The hotel manager, who had been counting the evening's successes by donor pledges and press photos, found himself counting breaths instead. In the subtle recalculation occurring around them, the metric shifted. Impact no longer meant money raised, but hope restored. The transformation was quiet and undeniable. It wasn't mystical in the way legends demand. It was human in the way decisions accumulate into a life. Emily had decided to step forward when others stepped back. That was the turning point. The doctor knelt on the other side of Richard and spoke softly to the child, his authority cloaked in respect. "Sweetheart, we're going to keep helping him, okay? Can you keep talking to him while we do?" Emily nodded. She didn't ask for permission to stay. She acknowledged a partnership. "Mr. Miller," she said, now careful and slow, "my grandma used to tell me to count in fours when I got scared. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. She modelled the pace with her own breath, and the room astonishingly fell into it with her, not audibly, not in unison, but in posture and patience. Even Richard, who detested being coached on anything outside a negotiation, felt his ribcage catch and then comply. "I can't," he muttered, a last defence. "You can," Emily said, without pressure. "Start small." The nurse checked a monitor and muttered something technical to the doctor, the kind of line that would sound like static to anyone but a clinician. To everyone else, the more meaningful data sat between Emily's hand and Richard's. People in the back rose onto their toes and then settled, convinced the view would change if they waited long enough. It did, but not in the way a spectacle changes. It changed in the way a mindset does, incrementally, through a sequence of tiny inward concessions. A billionaire decided to let a child lead him through four-count breathing. Guests accustomed to outcomes yielded to process. A mother decided not to yank her daughter away from what frightened her. And Emily, in the very center, kept choosing to stay. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Somewhere, between clinical and kind. Richard had never answered that question honestly. Pain, in his world, existed to be conquered or hidden. "Yes," he said, finally letting a piece of himself be ordinary. "Okay," Emily replied. "Then we make space for it and breathe through the middle." The phrasing, simple and imprecise, slipped past the armored language of medicine and money, reached the place where endurance is negotiated. The doctor, hearing it, found himself adjusting his own tone. "Mr. Miller," keep following her voice, he said, as if the 8-year-old were part of the team. In the balcony's reflection wall, the scene doubled. 2 Emilys, 2 Richards, 2 versions of the same moment, the one where control stays clenched, and the one where it softens just enough to let help in. This was the quiet revelation that rewired the room. The child did not heal the man by replacing science or saving him through spectacle. She invited a different physiology of hope, one that medicine recognizes, even if it cannot prescribe it. Under the hum of the defibrillator cart and the oxygen hiss, something recalibrated. No one cheered, no one clapped. People simply listened harder. "Why are you not afraid?" Richard asked, the question surprising even him. "I am," Emily said, and there was no bravado in it. "But fear is just a thing that comes and goes. You can still decide." The word decide landed with an impact far beyond her age. Decisions had built Richard's empire, calculated, ruthless, and timed to markets. The decision she meant belonged to a different market entirely, one where value is measured by attention and mercy and the willingness to be present for someone else's worst minute. It was the kind of choice he had neglected so consistently that making it now felt both impossible and embarrassingly simple. From behind the floral centerpiece, a whisper ran through the guests. "He moved." Another voice. "His color. Do you see it?" The doctor didn't announce a turnaround. He didn't have one to announce. He had a patient whose resistance had eased by a hair's breadth, and in critical moments, a hair is a mile. "Good," he said softly, not to the room, but to the child and the man. "That's good." Somewhere near the back, a waitstaff member closed her eyes for a second, as if to mark the exact hinge where despair became something else, not certainty, but room. The journey had not reversed direction. It had widened, offering an exit that hadn't been visible a minute earlier. Sarah stepped closer and crouched at Emily's shoulder, not to pull her back but to anchor her. "I'm right here," she murmured, and Emily gave the smallest nod without releasing Richard's hand. The togetherness of that triangle, mother, daughter, stranger, looked nothing like the image Richard had spent years cultivating, the one where he stood alone at the top. From the floor, the summit looked like a poorer idea than it once had. He felt himself grieving something he hadn't known to name, the years he had lived, as if proximity were a liability. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, not meaning breathing, not meaning pain management, meaning the more dangerous admission. "You don't have to know," Emily replied. "You can learn. People can." Learning, for Richard, had always been a competition. He learned faster, outmaneuvered rivals, absorbed information like capital. What Emily offered was a different syllabus, apprenticeship to presence. He followed her count again. And this time it wasn't just compliance, it was consent. The doctor adjusted the oxygen, the nurse recorded the changes, and the numbers edged, minutely, questionably, in a direction that didn't embarrass hope. The line between miracle and mechanism is paper-thin in rooms like this. What mattered was the alignment, a child's calm, a team's steadiness, a man's surrender. Around them, guests began seeing their own reflections differently. A CEO who had once cut benefits to meet a quarterly target remembered his father's last night in a county hospital. A publisher who had planned to pitch a glossy feature about the gala imagined a longer story about courage that never trends and kindness that never invoices. Not because they suddenly became saints, but because moments like this reorder the hierarchy of what feels important. This wasn't about publicity, it was about proximity and the decisions it asks of you. The impact, if it lasted, would not be measured by headlines, but by altered habits. Afterward, Richard's gaze fixed, not fully clear but steadier. He studied the freckles on Emily's nose as if they were coordinates on a map he'd never traveled. "What's your name?" he asked, the question near broken but sincere. "Emily," she said. "Emily Johnson." He absorbed it with a seriousness he once reserved for the surnames of billionaires. "Thank you, Emily Johnson," he said, and the words sounded foreign to his own ears. Not because he was unused to gratitude, people had thanked him his whole life, but because he was unused to offering it where he had no leverage to gain. He felt the room again, its dimensions, its cold floor, the chandelier's fragile geometry. He also felt something internal unclench, the smallest recalibration of posture. Pride had kept his jaw locked for years. Now it gave him a centimeter of space. "I thought money could fix everything," he admitted, as if confessing to an empty church. "Sometimes money helps," Emily answered, careful not to argue with what she didn't know. "Sometimes people do." In her phrasing, the hierarchy inverted, and he let it stand. He had built an empire on certainty. Now he found himself sustained by a child's ordinary sentence. The doctor met Sarah's eyes and gave a restrained nod. Not triumph, not a promise, just acknowledgement that something was shifting. "We're transporting him," he said to his team, and even that sentence felt different than it would have 10 minutes earlier. Motion no longer sounded like defeat. It sounded like a next step in a journey that had refused to end when the algorithm predicted it would. They secured the gurney, and for a moment Richard resisted the separation, fingers tightening weakly around Emily's. "I'll be right here," she said, misreading the grip as fear of the move. "We'll walk slow." He released her hand and then, unexpected even to himself, reached for it again. Not out of panic, but out of gratitude he couldn't locate words for. "You matter," he said, the syllables rough. Emily blinked, surprised by the earnestness, then nodded once, the way kids do when they accept something without either minimizing it or making it grand. The doctor motioned, the wheels clicked, and the circle parted, making space for passage. The lights above traced a white corridor on Richard's retinas, as if drawing a path forward he had not foreseen. In the soft rattle of the gurney and the measured pace of the team, the room learned a final, quiet lesson about power. Sometimes it is the courage to move a few feet at human speed without guaranteeing the outcome. The elevator doors opened with a dignified sigh, and as the team guided the gurney inside, Emily stepped back just enough to let the professionals do their work without breaking the thread she had tied. Richard's eyes found her one more time before the doors drew in the world. "In 2, 3, 4, she mouthed, exaggerating the count so he could follow even without sound. He did, once, and then again, not because breathing was easy, but because someone had made it shareable. The doors closed, carrying the man upward toward fluorescent lights and clinical clarity, and leaving behind a chandeliered room that felt for the first time all evening like a place where something real had happened. The guests exhaled, not together, Not loudly, just enough to admit they had been holding their breath. Sarah slid an arm around Emily's shoulders, and for a second the two of them simply stood there, not victorious, not intimidated, just present in the afterglow of a decision that had changed more than one life. And in that soft, altered quiet, the story did what stories do when they are still becoming. It folded forward, already setting the next revelation in motion. They guided the gurney toward the service corridor, wheels murmuring over tile as the ballroom receded into a hush that felt almost reverent. The elevator doors waited like a neutral judge, flawless steel, no opinion, just assent. Richard's face, moments earlier the mask of a man losing his bargain with breath, carried a new, fragile animation. It wasn't triumph, not even confidence. It was the smallest reclaiming, the body's quiet decision to stay. Emily kept pace beside the paramedics, her fingers no longer clasping his butt, hovering close, like a lighthouse does not touch a ship, yet still carries it toward shore. The behind-the-scenes world of the hotel flickered past. Utility carts, stacked trays, a mop bucket abandoned. Mid-shift, ordinary objects that made the moment more human, less staged. Sarah walked 2 steps behind her daughter, hands knotted, torn between pride and the impulse to apologize to everyone in uniform for the breach of protocol that no one seemed eager to correct. Halfway to the elevator, a sound interrupted the metronome of the wheels, a long, uncertain inhale that didn't belong to the oxygen feed. Richard's chest rose deeper than before, held, then steadied into a rhythm that turned heads. One of the medics glanced at the monitor, then at the man, then back again, as if the screen were the one making a mistake. Pulse climbing, respiration smoother. The doctor's professionalism was a narrow bridge. He walked it carefully. "Mr. Miller, can you hear me?" The answer was not a word, but the intention behind a twitch, the jaw unclenching, a brow furrowing against light. It was the kind of intention that precedes decisions. He had made empires from decisive moments. This one was purely biological, but its impact fell across everyone in the corridor like a new script thrown into rehearsal. Richard's eyes parted to a sliver. He found the ceiling first, a bland square of tiles, and then, unnervingly, his own reflection in the paramedic's visor. Vulnerable, unarmored, human, the reality of it made him want to retreat. Then, Emily stepped into that reflection's edge with the small gravity of her presence. "Hi," she said, as if they were meeting on a park bench. "You're doing better." He didn't trust his voice. He tried anyway. "Feels strange." The word rasped, but it existed, and a few onlookers breathed as if they had been waiting for permission to do the same. "Strange is okay," Emily replied, matter of fact. "Strange just means new." The elevator chimed. They rolled him in. The doctor touched a finger to the carotid, eyes narrowing at what the fingertip reported. "We're getting something." The nurse, cautious enough to avoid prophecy, allowed herself a single, amazed exhale that sounded like gratitude in a language without nouns. "Sir, if you can keep that rhythm, you're going to make our job a lot easier," she said, gentleness wrapped in clinical instruction. Richard's gaze slid to Emily again, pulled not by the novelty of her, but by the steadiness. "Stay," he managed. "I'm right here," she said, and though she could not follow him into the medical wing beyond a certain point, the promise held as a kind of orientation, a north he could find even with his eyes closed. They reached the ambulance bay, the winter air cooler and cleaner than the ballroom's perfumed heaviness. The city's distant noise felt different out here, more honest, less staged. The team transferred him with practiced efficiency, and the vehicle's interior swallowed him with bright light and tidy equipment. The doctor leaned into the doorway, caught between disbelief and discipline. "Let's keep monitoring. BP is still low, but the trend—" He didn't finish, not because he lacked words, but because the word he needed, improvement, felt too light for the weight of what was happening. Improvement belongs to business decks and quarterly slides. This, whatever it was, threaded itself through mindset, fear, and surrender. It didn't ask the room to cheer, it asked the man to keep choosing breath. During the short ride, Richard felt the distance between refusal and acceptance like a narrow corridor he could finally walk. He'd spent years outrunning vulnerability with speed and steel. Now he realized he could move through it inch by inch and not die from contact. He thought of deals he had closed by strangling doubt. He thought of Emily counting 4 beats as if time itself could be negotiated into kindness. "I didn't know I was afraid," he said, surprising the medic at his side. "You don't look like the afraid type," the medic answered, a half-smile not unkind. "I built that look," Richard whispered, as if confessing to a designer. "Then maybe let it rest," the medic said, "not as therapy, just as procedure." The vehicle hit a seam in the asphalt and kept going. The heart, too, found a seam and kept going. They wheeled him into the emergency department, where fluorescent lights don't flatter and questions never wear tuxedos. The pace was swift, but not panicked. A different doctor took over. Dr. Patel, coat unbuttoned, eyes focused with the kind of calm you wear after 1,000 nights like this. She listened to the handoff, her attention a tuned instrument. Episodes of Brady, responded to supportive contact, spontaneous stabilization noted, the paramedic said, tripping over the oddity of saying those words together. Dr. Patel absorbed the data and then absorbed the man. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Patel. We're going to run tests, rule out what we can, manage what we must. You're still in a risky zone, but something shifted. Can you sit a little?" He didn't think he could. He also didn't think he couldn't. Between those two uncertainties, a decision took. "Root, help me try," he said. The team adjusted the bed. It wasn't a movie moment. There was no swell of strings, no triumphant angle. It was measured, careful, the choreography of risk. But then the improbable threaded itself through the measured. With their support, he angled upward inch by inch until he was unmistakably sitting, breath thin, but dependable. The monitor responded with a line that, while not pretty, was legible and steady enough to win a nod from the nurse, who did not nod easily. "Well, I'll be," someone murmured near the doorway, and in a different room of the mind a headline wrote itself and then wisely erased its exclamation point. "Impossible," one intern blurted before catching himself, the word a reflex against the insult of wonder. Dr. Patel's look, quick and warm, corrected without scolding. "Not impossible," she said, "unlikely, and happening." The distinction mattered. It preserved science while making room for whatever else had just joined the table. Mindset, will, presence, the hidden truth that bodies sometimes need permission more than orders. Richard let his head settle back against the pillow, every muscle learning what it meant to stabilize. "I should be angry," he said quietly, startling himself with honesty. "I should be embarrassed." He felt neither. He felt altered, not saved, not fixed, but tilted toward life like a plant that has found light after growing against a wall. In the waiting area, Emily sat beside Sarah, swinging her feet just above the floor, unaware that a story had already begun to travel through the hotel staff, text threads, and out to dinner tables uptown. She wasn't thinking about the impact or the journey, or what people would call it later. She was thinking about whether the man could keep counting to 4 without her voice in the room. "Do you think he's okay?" she asked. Sarah brushed a loose strand of hair behind Emily's ear with a hand still faintly scented of lemon cleaner. "I think you gave him something no one else could," she said. "It wasn't magic, it was permission." "He did the breathing," Emily answered, not claiming more than was hers. "I was just there." Back in the bay, the team continued with method, labs, scans, a cascade of deliberate steps. Even as medicine resumed its familiar command, the mystery didn't leave. It simply took a seat beside the machines. Richard glanced at the doorway as if expecting the small blue dress to appear. "Dr. Patel understood before," he asked. "The girl," she said. "She's outside with her mother. We'll let them know how you're doing." His face loosened with relief, the kind you feel for a lighthouse you may never see again, but know is somewhere. faithfully burning. "Why did you come back?" he asked the ceiling, a question not meant for doctors or gods, so much as for the part of himself he had neglected. An answer didn't arrive in language. It arrived in sensation, the memory of a hand that had not claimed him, only accompanied him. He realized how foreign accompaniment was to a man who had worn independence like chainmail. "I don't remember the last time someone stayed without needing something," he said, and though his voice barely crossed the room, the nurse charting nearby heard and looked up with an unreadable softness. "People surprise you," she said, not as a platitude, as an observation assembled from 1,000 nights like this. The monitor steadied into a slow, persuasive rhythm, the kind you want music to take from because it sounds like a decision has been made. Tests would name the threat later, arrhythmia layered onto exhaustion, a cardiovascular rebellion finally called to heal. But that medical storyline would never fully explain the pivot everyone felt. The pivot wore the shape of humility, and humility, once tried on, fit more comfortably than Richard expected. He found himself whispering thank you to no one in particular, and to several someones exactly. "Thank you for not leaving," he said, and when Dr. Patel assumed he meant the staff, he added, "and the girl." "We'll see that she knows," the doctor replied. Outside the bay curtains, the hospital moved at its ordinary clip, a river of needs and answers, worry and relief. Yet people who had brushed the moment, the paramedic with the visor, the intern who said impossible, the nurse who guarded her nods, all felt a small internal recalibration, as if their own decisions tomorrow might tilt closer to the generosity the child modeled. That is how revelation works when it is real. Not by spectacle, but by altering trajectories half a degree at a time until an entire life arrives somewhere kinder. News of the gala had already begun its predictable journey. Screens lighting up, feeds refreshing, publicists drafting sentences. But inside the ER, the story refused to be flattened into a headline. It remained complex, stubbornly human. Richard spoke again, voice low and deliberate. "I want to see her. To tell her." "Myself." Dr. Patel measured the request the way you measure a medicine: dose, timing, side effects. "Not yet," she said gently. "You need to rest. Let's make sure your body agrees with this truce it just declared." He accepted the boundary without resentment. That surprised him as much as anything else. All evening, his power had been revised downward. Each revision felt less like loss and more like precision. Power, it turned out, could be the capacity to say yes to help. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to inventory. Breaths that once had to be bullied now arrived like cautious guests who were nonetheless willing to stay. He pictured the ballroom, the abrupt silence, the circle of strangers, the hidden truth that wealth had never insulated him from need. He pictured Emily's face, steady as a verdict and kind as a hand on a fevered brow. "We can still decide," she had said. The sentence rewrote something in him so simply he hadn't noticed how radical it was. Decision, for him, had always been an instrument of control. Now it felt like participation, and because nights like these have a way of curating coincidences, a volunteer chaplain walking past the bay heard a child's laugh carry in from the waiting area and paused, smiling at the sound without needing to know its source. Down the hall, an orderly folded blankets with habitual care, unaware of how perfectly he embodied what the girl had done, make something warm where cold had been assumed. Small acts, ordinary choices. This was the architecture of transformation that never makes the news, but wins the future. Richard opened his eyes and looked at Dr. Patel. "Do you believe in whatever this is?" He gestured vaguely, embarrassed by the squishiness of the question. The doctor tugged her coat cuff, considering. "I believe the body can be convinced," she said, "by medicine, by timing, by courage, by another person's steadiness. Tonight, you were convinced." He absorbed it like a reasonable hypothesis. "I'd Like to learn how to keep being convinced, he said, and the room, if a room can approve, seemed to agree with the goal. He adjusted himself in the slightly raised bed, a position that 30 minutes earlier would have mocked him. Now it welcomed him back to his own life, not as the CEO of breath, but as its apprentice. Beyond the curtain, footsteps moved and paused, the choreography of a place where endings and continuations share the same corridor. He felt the world again. Cool. Air-distant voices, the remembered shape of a small hand on his. Somewhere just beyond the doors, in a chair too big for her, a girl waited with the patience of someone who doesn't need credit to believe in impact. The machinery ticked in agreement, not with theology, but with the physics of a change that had begun and was not finished. The night, which had started as a pageant of certainty and then bent toward surrender, now held its breath differently, not in fear, but in readiness, already, assembling the next set of revelations that awaited the man who sat, improbably, undeniably, upright. By dawn, the gala was no longer remembered for its music or the guest list, but for the image that had slipped from the ballroom into the bloodstream of the city, a millionaire collapsing, and a child's hand steadying him when even machines could not. Headlines sprouted across every outlet before Richard had finished his first hospital scan. "Millionaire saved by child's touch," read the New York Times. The Daily News opted for sharper contrast. Powerless tycoon, innocent savior. Television anchors repeated the story with voices trained to balance skepticism and awe, yet even as they leaned on the safer words, coincidence, timing, recovery, the tone betrayed a different curiosity. Reporters camped outside St. Luke's Hospital, jostling for statements from anyone who had been at the gala. Guests, still processing their own shock, spoke cautiously, their phrases betraying something beyond gossip. A senator said, "I saw the monitors flatlining, and then it was like he decided to stay the moment she touched him." A hotel server whispered, "I don't know what it was, but it didn't feel like coincidence." And somewhere between their testimonies and the grainy cell phone footage that had already surfaced online, the narrative gained a pulse of its own. The video clips, Emily kneeling, Richard's hand twitching, the crowd falling silent, spread across feeds and timelines, replayed with hashtags that carried both disbelief and longing. Medical experts entered the conversation with measured caution. Cardiologists debated on morning shows whether the stabilization could be explained by vagal response, psychosomatic influence, or a spontaneous correction triggered by sheer timing. "The human body can surprise us," one professor said. "Sometimes a shift in stress or focus allows autonomic systems to recalibrate." Another countered, "But to attribute it to a child's presence borders on mysticism." And yet, when asked whether stress and comfort could tangibly impact survival in crisis, even the skeptics conceded, "We cannot rule out the psychological impact." For Richard, hearing the debate was almost surreal. Lying in a hospital bed surrounded by beeping machines and monitors, he listened to doctors explain what might have happened. They spoke in technical language: arrhythmia, ischemic stress, spontaneous recovery. But none of it touched the experience he remembered. "It wasn't the medicine," he muttered more than once, his voice hoarse but insistent. "It was her." When Dr. Patel pressed him gently for clarification, he shook his head, frustrated by his own inability to translate. "I felt something when she touched me. Not physical, something else. Warmth, like being anchored. I don't have the vocabulary for it." Emily and Sarah, meanwhile, had returned home to Queens before dawn. The hotel had no choice but to quietly thank them, despite the breach of rules, because the story was already too public to erase. Sarah worried about the sudden attention, about cameras showing up at their modest apartment, or reporters digging into their lives. Emily, still small enough to think wonder was ordinary, only asked, "Is he okay now?" Her mother pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "I think he's better because of you." Emily wrinkled her nose. "He's better because he wanted to live," she said softly. "I just reminded him." In the days that followed, The media frenzy collided with Richard's own reckoning. For a man who had once believed that perception was everything, it was strange to watch his name trend for reasons he couldn't control. His PR team urged him to release a statement attributing his survival to the excellence of emergency medicine, but Richard refused. "I'll thank the doctors," he told them, "but I won't erase her." When pressed about optics, he leaned back against his hospital pillow and said, "Maybe, for once, my optics can be the truth." When the cameras eventually reached him, his voice was weaker than the polished tones people were used to, but his words carried more weight because of it. "I've been saved many times in business," he said to a cluster of microphones, "but never in life. A child gave me something no money ever could, a reason to keep breathing when I wanted to stop." The line spread across networks in minutes, quoted, dissected, doubted, admired. Experts kept arguing, but ordinary people listened differently. The story wasn't about cardiology or coincidence anymore. It was about humility, piercing arrogance, about innocence, intruding on pride. Behind the scenes, Richard spent hours in silence, replaying the moment of contact. He could still feel the imprint of her hand, small, certain, steady. For a man who had once measured people by what they could deliver, it was a revelation to realize that the person who had given him the most had expected nothing in return. He thought of all the decisions he had made, mergers, acquisitions, dismissals, each framed by leverage and profit. This one, the most important moment of his life, had carried no negotiation at all. "Why would she even come to me?" he asked aloud one night, staring at the ceiling. The nurse changing his IV smiled without looking up. "Because kids don't ask who deserves help, they just help." Emily didn't watch the news coverage, though her classmates whispered about it at school. To her, the idea of being called a savior felt strange, almost embarrassing. She told her teacher one afternoon, "I didn't fix him, I just held his hand." But the adults around her knew that sometimes the smallest gesture changes the trajectory of a life. Richard's recovery was slower than the headlines suggested. Sitting up had been the first victory. Walking across the ward was the next. Each step reminded him that wealth could buy trainers and equipment, but not will. He whispered to himself, echoing Emily's rhythm, "In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. The mantra was absurdly simple for a man who once spent fortunes to solve problems, yet it steadied him more than any portfolio he had ever owned. The fascination around his collapse refused to fade. Think tanks hosted panels about the power of human connection in medicine. Psychologists discussed the placebo effect and the biology of hope. But Richard knew what none of them could chart: the way his pride had cracked open in front of a child, and how that crack was the only reason light had entered. That hidden truth was something he could not deny. For the first time in decades, he admitted not just to others but to himself. He was alive because someone had cared enough to stay when everyone else stepped back. And in that admission lay the seed of a transformation he hadn't anticipated. Because once you accept that your survival hinged on grace rather than strategy, every decision afterward feels different. Every journey forward asks new questions. Richard wasn't sure yet what those answers would look like, but he knew he could no longer return to the man who walked into that ballroom believing he was untouchable. The story, already bigger than him, was still unfolding, and he was no longer just its subject. He was, reluctantly, part of its lesson. And as reporters clamored for more details, as experts debated causes and strangers shared their own stories of unexpected kindness, Richard Miller prepared to meet the girl again, the one whose touch had given him back a life he wasn't certain he deserved. Richard's release from the hospital didn't happen with fanfare. There were no champagne glasses raised, no grand speeches, no victory banners. Instead, there was a wheelchair rolling down a corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic, a nurse pushing him through double doors, and the cold bite of New York winter greeting his skin. Photographers swarmed outside, their lenses eager to capture the weakened figure of a man once synonymous with power. He looked older than he had weeks before, thinner, paler, his once iron posture softened into something more fragile. But within his chest, behind the visible frailty, something had begun to shift. His mindset no longer orbited around control and domination. The collapse had carved a crack in the armor, and through that crack had poured an unexpected revelation. He had survived not because of wealth, but because of a girl whose world couldn't be further from his own. For the first time in decades, Richard found himself curious about someone else's life, not for leverage, but for understanding. He had asked his assistant to track down Emily Johnson and her mother, not through lawyers or PR consultants, but with a quiet sincerity that surprised even him. "I need to see them," he said simply, when questioned why. "Not because it looks good, because it's the truth." The words felt odd leaving his mouth, heavy with a humility he wasn't used to carrying. The Johnsons lived in a modest apartment in Queens. The building was worn, its brick exterior weathered by years of winters and summers, the paint peeling on the stairwell banisters. Sarah Johnson had spent her life juggling multiple jobs, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables on weekends, doing whatever was needed to keep the lights on and food on the table. Emily, though only 8, already understood more about sacrifice than most adults. She shared a small bedroom with walls decorated by hand-drawn pictures and library books stacked on a rickety shelf. Their home wasn't filled with riches, but it carried something else. Warmth, a kind of love that doesn't need chandeliers to shine. When Richard arrived, escorted only by a driver and without his usual entourage, Sarah nearly closed the door on instinct. She wasn't used to men like him stepping into her world. He looked so out of place in the narrow hallway, his tailored coat brushing against walls barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. But before she could say anything, Emily darted forward, her eyes lighting up. "You came," she said, with the same simple certainty she had used when she held his hand. Richard, who had spent his life rehearsing speeches, found no speech at all. "I had to," he said softly. Inside, he sat on their worn sofa, the fabric frayed but clean, and looked around the small living room. There were no expensive paintings, no marble, no carefully curated image, just photos of family pinned to the wall, school, drawings stuck to the fridge, a half-knitted scarf draped over a chair. It was a behind-the-scenes reality that no amount of his wealth could imitate, and it humbled him. He turned to Sarah with an honesty that startled even himself. "I don't know how to thank you for what your daughter did. People are calling it a miracle. Some say coincidence, but I know what I felt. It wasn't medicine that brought me back. It was her presence, her kindness." Sarah, still wary, crossed her arms. "She's just a child, Mr. Miller. She did what came naturally to her. No one taught her to walk toward pain instead of away from it. She just does." Richard looked at Emily, who sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing in a notebook as if nothing about her life had changed. "Why did you help me?" he asked her directly. She shrugged without lifting her head. "Because you look scared," she said matter-of-factly, "and scared people shouldn't be alone." The simplicity of her words disarmed him more than any boardroom challenge ever had. He had built his empire on complexity, strategies, hidden truths, and layers of decisions. Yet here was a child reducing survival to its core, presence. The revelation hit him with quiet force. He realized he had spent a lifetime measuring his worth in numbers, while what had saved him couldn't be counted at all. As the afternoon unfolded, Richard stayed longer than he planned. Sarah offered coffee in mismatched mugs, and he accepted, though he wasn't used to, drinking anything not served in bone china. He listened to Emily chatter about school, about the book she was reading, about the dog she wanted but couldn't have because the landlord didn't allow pets. For the first time, Richard didn't interrupt, didn't steer the conversation toward himself. He simply listened, and in listening, something inside him loosened further. He began to see the hidden truth behind their lives, the struggles Sarah carried quietly, the decisions she made daily to stretch. Every dollar, the impact of living in a world where opportunity was rationed by class and circumstance. And in that reflection, he saw himself not as the hero of his story, but as someone who had overlooked the humanity of people like them for far too long. It was uncomfortable, but it was also transformative. At one point, Emily asked him a question that made him pause. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, tilting her head with the curiosity only a child can wield without malice. Richard opened, his mouth ready to deflect, to cover himself with pride, but instead the truth slipped out. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "all the time." Emily nodded, as if she had expected the answer. "Then maybe that's why you got sick," she said. "Sometimes hearts get tired of being alone." Her words lingered in the room, a revelation delivered without agenda. For Richard, it was like holding up a mirror he had avoided for decades. He thought of his estranged son, of the empty penthouse he returned to night after night, of the countless faces he had dismissed as unimportant because they couldn't advance his empire. And in that moment, his arrogance melted into something softer, humility, tinged with regret, but also with the possibility of change. Before he left, he stood by the door and turned to Sarah. "I know money doesn't solve everything. I've lived long enough to learn that lesson the hard way, but I want to help you, not as charity, not as a transaction, but as gratitude. Please let me." Sarah hesitated, her pride battling with practicality, but Emily spoke up first. "If you really want to help, don't forget what you felt. Don't go back to being the same as before." Her eyes locked on his with a seriousness that felt older than her years. "I won't," he promised, and for the first time in a long time, he meant every word. As Richard stepped out into the cold evening, the city lights blinking against the dark sky, he felt lighter, though his body was still weak. He realized that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about deciding differently from this moment forward. He had been given a second chance, not earned by power or wealth, but gifted by a child who saw him not as a millionaire, but simply as a man who needed saving. And as the car pulled away from the modest Queen's apartment, he knew his journey of transformation had only just begun, with revelations waiting to shape not only his life, but the lives of those he would choose to impact next. Richard's life, after the hospital, did not return to the neat rhythm it once held. His calendar, once stacked with meetings and negotiations that determined the fate of entire companies, now carried different entries. Medical checkups, quiet evenings of reflection, and long stretches of silence that unsettled him at first, but gradually became his most valuable appointments. For a man who had built his identity around noise and motion, learning to be still was a transformation in itself. Yet it was not stillness alone that redefined him. It was the pressing conviction that the second chance he had been given demanded more than words of gratitude whispered in private. It demanded decisions, visible and lasting ones, that carried impact beyond his own name. The first step was small, but symbolic. Richard had long supported charity galas, but only as photo opportunities and tax write-offs. Now, he cancelled his appearance at one such event and instead scheduled a visit to a children's hospital in Brooklyn. No cameras, no press releases, just him walking the halls with the kind of humility he had once thought beneath him. The children there didn't care about his fortune. They asked him questions about his strange hospital gown stories, laughed at how clumsy he had been learning to use a walker, and showed him their drawings taped to the walls. One little boy, fighting a serious illness, grabbed Richard's hand and said, "You look like someone who gets scared too." Richard knelt down and answered, "Honestly, I do, more than I ever admitted." That exchange, private and unrecorded, moved him more than any deal he had ever struck. From that moment, he began redirecting resources, not into luxury projects or speculative markets, but into initiatives that would change lives where change mattered most. He called a press conference, not in one of his glass towers, but on the steps of St. Luke's Hospital, where his collapse had first drawn the world's attention. The cameras crowded close, the reporters eager for a headline. Richard's voice, once sharp and commanding, now carried a steadier, humbler weight. "I've built an empire," he began, his hands folded, his gaze direct. "But when I fell, that empire couldn't lift me. My money didn't save me. My power didn't save me. A child's touch did. And that truth demands more from me than going back to business as usual." Gasps echoed through the press line, not because the words were theatrical, but because they rang with the rarest quality. In public speech, sincerity. Richard went on to announce the creation of a foundation dedicated to children's healthcare, pledging millions to fund pediatric wards, provide equipment, and cover medical costs for families who could not afford them. "I was given breath when I should have lost it," he continued. "Now I want to make sure that gift multiplies, so no child stands alone, and no family has to choose between survival and debt." Emily and Sarah were not present at the conference, but their absence was felt in every syllable. Reporters inevitably asked about the girl who had changed his life. Richard didn't hide her identity, but he was protective. "Emily Johnson is not a symbol," he said firmly. "She's a child who showed me what it means to care without condition. She doesn't need the spotlight. She needs a world where children like her are given the same chances I once took for granted." The statement drew nods, even from cynical journalists who had covered too many hollow promises. Behind the scenes, Richard worked with teams of doctors and administrators to make the foundation more than a press stunt. He visited underfunded hospitals, spoke privately with nurses about what they lacked, and redirected profits from his companies into endowments for clinics. He walked the fluorescent corridors, not as a donor to be praised, but as a student learning from those who had always carried the quiet burden of care. "Tell me what you need," he would say, sitting in break rooms with staff over styrofoam cups of coffee, "and I'll figure out how to give it without strings attached." The transformation was not without resistance. Board members questioned his decisions, investors worried about reduced returns, and old acquaintances scoffed that his collapse had softened him into weakness. But Richard no longer measured strength by the same metrics. "If I lose money saving children," he told one critic flatly, "that's a trade I will never regret." His conviction, once a tool of intimidation, had become an instrument of clarity. The impact rippled outward. Families in struggling neighborhoods found relief in hospital bills covered by the foundation. Clinics received updated machines that turned despair into treatment. And children, whose names the world would never know, breathed easier because a man who once believed only in numbers had decided to believe in them. Yet Richard's most profound transformation wasn't captured in news articles or financial reports. It was visible in smaller, subtler moments, in the way he greeted his estranged son with a letter that began not with advice, but with an apology, in how he lingered longer in conversations instead of rushing toward the next task, in the quiet nights he spent replaying Emily's words as though they were scripture written just for him. "Scared people shouldn't be alone." That single line had dismantled decades of arrogance and rebuilt him into someone who finally understood what wealth was meant. 4 months later, when the foundation officially opened its first dedicated children's wing at St. Luke's, Richard insisted Emily and Sarah be there. Emily cut the ribbon with oversized scissors, her smile shy but radiant, while reporters snapped photos that would appear across the nation. Richard stood behind her, not as the central figure, but as a man finally comfortable letting someone else shine. When asked by a journalist if he believed in miracles now, Richard answered with calm certainty, "I don't know what label you want to use, but I know I was given a second chance, and I know it came from a child who had nothing to gain and everything to teach me." The words traveled far, quoted in speeches, shared on social media, even debated in classrooms about leadership and humility. But for Richard, the true reward wasn't the echo of applause. It was the quiet knowledge that the empire he had once thought unshakable now rested on a foundation of something far stronger than marble or money, gratitude. And gratitude, once awakened, has a way of reshaping not just a man's future, but the legacy he leaves behind. The story of his collapse had begun as a spectacle, a curiosity that made headlines. But it was becoming something else entirely, a parable of transformation, a reminder that even the most fortified lives can be broken open by innocence, and that redemption often arrives in the simplest form, a child's hand, steady and unafraid. Richard Miller understood now that his journey was far from over. What had started with a fall in a glittering ballroom had turned into a calling that would lead him into places he had never dared to step before, carrying lessons that no empire could ever buy. And as he stood watching Emily laugh with other children at the hospital's new playroom, he felt, perhaps for the first time, what it meant not just to live, but to live rightly. Richard had lived through battles with markets, corporate wars, and the endless noise of ambition, but none of those encounters had pierced him the way a child's hand had in a ballroom full of people who thought he was untouchable. That touch lingered in his memory with more permanence than the ink on his contracts. Months had passed since his collapse, yet whenever he closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of that tiny palm, the warmth that no medicine had ever explained. It was as if Emily had not just steadied his heart, but had rewritten the very rhythm of his existence. For a man who once measured strength by numbers on a balance sheet, the revelation was staggering. He had thought resilience meant refusing weakness, bulldozing through obstacles, demanding outcomes at any cost. But the hidden truth revealed itself in a moment of silence. Resilience was not the absence of fragility, it was the courage to accept help. That night in New York had shown him that sometimes transformation begins not with a grand decision, but with surrendering long enough for someone else to step forward. His empire, still intact, now looked different in his own eyes. The glass towers were no longer trophies, but tools. The wealth that once insulated him became a resource to open doors for others. Richard often told his closest confidants, "I thought my empire was indestructible, but I was wrong. It didn't save me when I fell. What saved me was love, disguised as a child's presence." And those words, spoken without performance, began to ripple beyond his boardrooms. Leaders, who had once admired him for his power, began listening to him for his vulnerability. Investors, who once praised his hard edge, were startled to find more meaning in his softening. He was no longer just Richard Miller, the untouchable tycoon. He had become something rarer, a man who admitted he had been wrong and allowed that admission to guide his future. Emily, still just a girl, didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what she had set in motion. To her, life returned to routines, schoolwork, drawings, afternoons with friends. Yet whenever she heard whispers about hospitals being funded or children's wings being built, she smiled in her quiet way, knowing that behind those changes lived a seed she had unknowingly planted. Her mother sometimes asked, "Do you understand how much you changed him?" Emily always shrugged, replying, "I didn't change him. He decided to change. I just reminded him he could." Those simple words carried a wisdom most adults never reach. True impact is never forced, it's invited. The press, hungry for narratives, called it redemption. Commentators debated whether it was genuine or strategic. But the people closest to Richard saw the difference. They noticed how he lingered at conversations with hospital staff, how he wrote letters in his own hand to families his foundation helped, how he looked at children not as symbols, but as individuals. He no longer moved through the world with the arrogance of someone convinced of his invulnerability, but with the humility of someone who had nearly lost everything and understood the gift of being given another chance. On the anniversary of his collapse, he was asked to deliver a speech at the opening of yet another children's hospital wing, this time in Queens, not far from where Emily lived. He stood before the crowd, thinner but stronger, no longer hiding behind the armor of perfection. Cameras pointed at him, but his eyes searched until they found Emily's in the front row, her feet swinging just above the ground. He cleared his throat, paused, and then said the words that had crystallized his journey. "Sometimes The greatest power is hidden in the smallest hands. I learned that power isn't money, isn't empire, isn't control. True wealth is love, and I only understood that because a child was brave enough to show me. The room filled with silence first, then with an applause that didn't sound like noise but like an acknowledgement of truth. People clapped, not because he was a millionaire who donated money, but because they recognized the revelation he had uncovered, something universal, something they too could carry into their own lives. For Richard, it was the most honest ovation he had ever received, and just as the applause settled, he stepped back from the microphone, letting the moment breathe. He didn't need to add more. The lesson was already there, woven into the journey that had taken him from arrogance to humility, from collapse to redemption. His story, once about fortune and failure, had become about connection, impact, and the unexpected ways transformation begins. And as his eyes returned to Emily, who smiled at him with the same quiet certainty as the night she touched his hand, Richard understood that the story was not closing. It was only continuing, unfolding like a path no one could predict, but one he was finally ready to walk with gratitude. And if you've walked with me all the way through this story, maybe it stirred something in you too. If it did, I'd love to know. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," or even just share what part spoke to you most. It's always meaningful to see how these stories connect with different hearts. And if the message resonated, tap the like button. It's a small gesture, but it helps this space grow so more people can find moments like this one. If you'd like to keep traveling with me through stories that carry lessons about life, kindness, and hidden truths, subscribe to the channel. That way, every new story finds its way straight to you. And before you go, there's another video right here that beautifully complements what we've just explored. Click and come with me there. I think you'll feel the same thread running through it.